Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's my very great pleasure to introduce our Valentine's Day speaker, John Gardner. His granddaughter, Lucia Stafford, an Olympic runner, was here also as his loyal supporter. In February last year, she became the Canadian record holder for the 1,000-meter distance. So welcome both to Senior College. I am well placed to introduce John, as I have known him since January 1950, almost exactly 74 years ago. That's when he appeared suddenly in our grade 8 class at Whitney Public School, a recent immigrant from the United States, and he dazzled the rest of us by taking his class notes in shorthand. He and I continued as co-students during our high school education at University of Toronto schools, about 4 blocks due north of here, and as undergraduates at the University of Toronto. John excelled academically and invariably stood first in his class all the way through high school and university. He has been similarly successful in his professional career, advancing to become president of the Sun Life Assurance Company of Canada. The bio sketch we sent out for this talk gives you an overview of his work and brings out his remarkable versatility and commitment in many arenas. As an example significant for the University of Toronto, he was on the governing council and the business board, and for 20 years he chaired the board of the Fields Institute for Research in Mathematical Sciences. But John is a multifaceted person, and despite his huge professional commitments, he has always given top priority to his family, his wife, their 3 children, and several grandchildren. And since today is Valentine's Day, I will briefly give you a Valentine's Day story about this and how it all started. Once upon a time, back in the early 1960s, a young man from Canada who was studying at Oxford University took a break to visit Spain. On the beach one day, his attention was irresistibly drawn to a young woman, and he wanted to make her acquaintance, but found to his dismay that they could not properly communicate. His Spanish was minuscule, and her English even more so. John must have worked hard to overcome this problem because, as my wife would say, with the speed of summer lightning, he learned Spanish. Perhaps not perfectly at first, but definitely enough for the story to have a happy ending. They married in Spain, settled in Canada, and enjoyed well over half a century of happy and productive years. John's versatility shows up again in his leisure activities, which are far from what you might expect for a successful business world heavyweight. He didn't spend much time flopped out on the beach or going to all-you-can-eat and drink boat cruises, but instead went off on long-distance arduous hikes through the mountains of North America and Europe. This led him, in due course, to the ancient pilgrims' routes in northern Spain, which he will tell us about. The pilgrimage tradition is centuries old, and our English scholars here will know about the pilgrimage to Canterbury, described by Geoffrey Chaucer in his landmark Canterbury Tales. Part of the attraction of the pilgrimage then and now is the diversity of fellow pilgrims. I like to imagine Chaucer's 14th century knight as John's analogous counterpart. A knight there was, and he a worthy man, who, from the moment that he first began to ride out in the world, loved chivalry, truth, honor, freedom, and all courtesy. I invite Sir John to lead us onwards. The floor is yours.
Harold, thank you for that very generous introduction. Am I at the right level for the microphone and so on? Good. I'll make just a general comment. First of all, I'm going to stick pretty closely to the script I have here because there are a lot of slides, and I've kind of got them orchestrated in such a way that I want to make sure they show up at the right point and we don't get out of phase, etc. So I hope you bear with me on that. I don't know if there's anyone else here in the audience who knows me or goes back as far as Harold does, his wife Leonore does, but is there anyone here who knows? No, it's impossible you know anything about me. But I can ask the question. I know from lunch table that some of you have had exposure to the Camino de Santiago. And who is aware of its story or has some knowledge of it? Okay, that makes it seem like a more friendly audience. But first, I should paint a brief picture of who I am and from where I came. I'm an inveterate walker with a passion for trekking in the mountains that goes back to my university days. Until I was in my early 70s, my preferred holiday was a week in the mountains and the hills of Eastern North America and the peaks of Europe, often with my children in hand. But eventually, my family and common sense kind of dictated that I should really confine my activity to more civilized, more level terrain. So I turned my attention to the Camino de Santiago. 60 years ago, I married in Spain. My wife, Encarnita, a Spaniard, as you heard, came with me to Canada where we created a family. She and other family members appear in the pictures you will see over the next half hour or so. My love of trekking, my passion for history, and an ever-growing interest in Encarnita's country have all merged to generate what has now become for me a 20-year focus on the Camino de Santiago. Encarnita walked 1,300 kilometers with me on one set of my Camino excursions, and my children have accompanied me on parts of others. But that's enough about me. Let me turn to the subject of today's talk, the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James. The Camino is a story whose roots go back to the time of Christ. In the early Middle Ages, the Camino was a challenge facing Christians. Today, it possesses an attractive power that has captured the attention of individuals from every country on the globe and the interest of people who profess many different faiths, not just Christianity. And with your permission, my talk will be well supported by photographs projected onto the screen, and we'll proceed along the following path. I will talk first about history. After all, the Camino is a journey that has been underway for 1,000 years. I will spend time on geography. As the Camino unrolls over 1,000 kilometers of land that changes in character from day to day. And when that background in place, I will describe how the modern pilgrim spends a typical day on the Camino. And I'll close my remarks with reflections on why individuals undertake the Camino and what a pilgrim gains from the experience. At the end of my presentation, I would welcome questions and we'll attempt answers. But during the presentation, if something I say is unclear or confusing, please let me know at that moment so I can clarify. Okay, the history of the Camino. How did Christ and his disciple James, born and killed on the far eastern shores of the Mediterranean Sea, end up sponsoring for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of individuals, a journey of 1,000 kilometers or more on foot at the opposite end of the Mediterranean? James was one of the 12 apostles of Jesus. Following the crucifixion, the apostle James was dispatched to the Iberian Peninsula to bring its inhabitants into the Christian faith. His recruiting results were not great, and he was recalled to Jerusalem, where he was martyred. James' body was shipped back across the Mediterranean and up the Atlantic coast of Europe, where he was buried in the northwest of the Iberian Peninsula in a cave on the shores of Galicia. A millennium goes by. One night, a light glowing in a cave attracts a Christian hermit who discovered the remains of the Apostle James. A crypt is constructed, and over the centuries, churches of ever-increasing size were erected, culminating in today's cathedral in the city of Santiago de Compostela. By this time, the reconquest, the recovery of the Iberian Peninsula by the Christians from the Moors was well underway. In the year 852, with the tide of battle going against the Christians, the Apostle James, astride a giant white horse, suddenly appeared and put the Moors to flight. That performance earned him the name Santiago Matamoros, James the Moor Slayer. His appearance at key moments in subsequent battles conferred on him the role of patron saint of Spain. The history so far, however, doesn't tell us why pilgrimages to Santiago came into existence, grew in numbers, and have persisted for more than 10 centuries. Even in pre-Christian times, there was something afoot. Long before Christ, indigenous Iberians, curious about the disappearance each evening of the sun beyond the far edge of the Western Sea, would walk west to Finisterre, to Land's End, to solve that puzzle. Later, medieval Christians walked to Santiago for religious motives. They were either begging God's favor or atoning for a church-adjudicated sin. In early Christian times, the Holy Land, Jerusalem, was a pilgrim's favorite destination. The rise of the Muslim world in the first centuries of the first millennium and the failure of second and subsequent Christian crusades created the need for a replacement pilgrimage destination. Bishop Gelmírez in 12th century Santiago de Compostela, he was fast off the mark and he grasped the opportunity. For his pilgrims, Santiago became the destination of choice. What was the medieval pilgrim facing when he set out for Santiago? The trip was not easy. There were no buses, no taxis, no credit cards. The land boasted very little population, and there were no roads and bridges. On their way, medieval pilgrims encountered bogs and bandits. Even the local feudal lords were not above exacting extortion from passing pilgrims. Disease and pestilence confronted pilgrims, many of whom were ill even before their journey began. The rulers of the various principalities making up the Iberian Peninsula funded support for the pilgrims and granted land and rights to those prepared to serve the pilgrim trade. Monastic orders, especially in France, established hospitals to provide care for the passing pilgrims. Chapels and churches were raised. Nobility granted charters to centers of habitation, and towns were created. For centuries, pilgrim traffic was heavy, hundreds of thousands undertaking the journey in some years, until a changing political and cultural Europe diluted the value of the pilgrimage and the traffic diminished. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and the rise in importance of Rome to the Catholic Church all combined to diminish the number of pilgrims going to Santiago. 19th century Romanticism, as far as Spain was concerned, led travelers to the southern Spain, to Andalusia, to explore the peninsula's Islamic heritage. And during the 20th century, the Franco years, interest in the pilgrimage dried up entirely. And in some of those years, fewer than 100 pilgrims recorded their arrival in Santiago. So what's going on today? The final decades of the 20th century witnessed a keen revival of interest in the Camino of Santiago, with pilgrims from all over the world participating. In a holy year, more than 200,000 pilgrims will present at Santiago's church office their credentials in order to obtain their certificates. To qualify today as a bona fide pilgrim, one needs walk only the final 100 kilometer. There's a well-worn path from a nearby asphalt road through a field to the 100 kilometer mark, just west of the Galician town of Sarria. Further away from Santiago, on stretches of the Camino line far to the east, walkers are fewer in number. Crossing the Pyrenees in the spring, there might be only 40 to 50 pilgrims a day. From where do these pilgrims come? Spaniards are the most numerous, as you'd expect, with the heaviest flow occurring during the summer months. Germany, France, and Italy provide a significant share of the traffic. In addition to a surprisingly large number of Canadians, especially Quebecers, I've encountered walkers from other parts of Europe, from Japan and Korea, from Australia, from Brazil and Argentina, from Ghana, and on goes the list. My impression of the average age of pilgrims walking in the spring is one side or the other of 60. Summer vacations bring that average age figure down dramatically. At this point, we're caught up. At this point, I would like to inject some comments that relate to history, but at the same time, they reflect my own personal interests and feelings. Comments about why I find the Camino a compelling experience. I think history is important to every person in this room. For many of you, it'll be the story of your profession or your discipline. For all of you, history is tracing the paths of earlier and current generations of your family. Lenore, we're doing that earlier today. But for few, it'll be the core nature of your scholarly discipline. And as we age and look back at the trail lying behind us, history speaks to us through reading and through conversation. But nothing matches the impact of sharing a historical moment by standing on the very ground where that history was made. My experience, more than once, has caused me to shiver as I realized I was right where the history had been forged. I have ascended to the lectern in the University of Salamanca, one of Europe's oldest universities, where Luis de Leon, a prominent but controversial 16th century mystic and poet, lectured. Challenging the institution, he was imprisoned for 4 years, but eventually cleared. He returned to his university in triumph, mounted to his lectern, and began his lecture, De Thebamos Hysterna Die. As we were saying yesterday, read the story on the printed page, it holds charm. Standing on the podium where Frau Luis made his dramatic return, I found myself becoming part of the historical event. Walking the Camino brings to vivid life many memorable moments. Who do you say the globe was first circumnavigated by? Wrong. Magellan in the 16th century did lead a small fleet of vessels from Spain around the southern tip of South America and across the Pacific. In the Philippines, however, battle broke out and Magellan was killed. One vessel, commanded by the flotilla's Basque navigator, Juan Sebastian Elcano, who had been there from the start, survived. He continued westward and returned to its port of departure. Magellan's body did complete the trip, but it was Elcano who plotted and commanded the remainder of the circumnavigation. Standing in front of the monument to him in his hometown, a small fishing village of Gueteria on Spain's Bay of Biscay coast, brings for me that story to life. Who knows how much the story of the 8th century knight errant Roland is reality and how much is romantic legend? A military leader who served Charlemagne well in various capacities, Roland's career and death are recorded. His story, however, entered the literary lore of Spain, Italy, France, much as did the romance of England's King Arthur. I have crossed the Pyrenees and descended into Spain through the wooded ravine where Knight Roland, protecting the rear of Charlemagne's retreating army against the vengeful Basques, was killed along with all his fellow knights. I have also crossed the Pyrenees back into France at the Brest de Rolande, a striking feature of the Pyrenean ridgeline that resembles a perfect denture, except for one missing central tooth. It is there that the romance has Roland, trapped by his enemy, is back against the ridge wall and attempting to destroy his magical sword Durandal by shattering it against the rock face. But lo and behold, a gap opens, permitting our hero and his companions to escape. The moment of history that struck home to me with the greatest force occurred at the edge of the tiny town of Remesal. Remesal is in the Castilian highlands, a town so small that grass grows high in the middle of its only street, and it doesn't even have a cafe. Isabella was Queen of Castile in the tag end of the 15th century, and her husband Ferdinand was King of Aragon. Together as a married couple, they ruled the peninsula. When Isabella died, her heir was her daughter, Juana. But Juana had a problem. The problem was not her being female. Juana was mentally completely out of whack. She was known at the time as Juana la Loca. Juana la Loca was married to Philip, who is called Philip the Handsome. Isabella's husband, Ferdinand, father of Juana la Loca, was accustomed to serving as regent of Castile when Isabella was busy. So who was going to rule now that Isabella was gone? Ferdinand or Philip the Handsome? The two contenders came to Remesal to talk. Philip was there, 10,000 armed troops on the slopes below the town, standing behind him. Ferdinand rode up on his horse, completely alone. They discussed the competitive situation, turned about, and went their separate ways. Standing on that very spot where this momentous meeting took place, two arch rivals vying for an enormous prize, one solidly backed by an army, the other relying solely on his personal aura, my breath was taken away. As an aside, a year later, Philip the Handsome died, and his widow Juana paraded his cadaver for over a year from city to city throughout Castile for her subjects to view. She was subsequently sent into seclusion. Ferdinand picked up the reins and served as regent of Castile and king of Aragon until his death. I'll move on now to geography. I'm asked the question, what is the Camino de Santiago like? What do you face when you're on the road to St. James? An adequate answer must contain geography as well as history. The Camino is a network of paths leading to Galicia, a region in the far northwest corner of Spain, a path followed by men and women from time immemorial. Medieval pilgrims walking this path were Christians, hoping for a reward from heaven or a return to good health. Sometimes they walked as punishment. The origins of the Camino, however, predate the birth of Christ, and the motives of today's walkers go well beyond the boundaries of the Christian faith. The Camino I walked with Encarnita began in a small French town, Saint-Jean-Pied-de-Port, nestled in the northern foothills of the Pyrenees. mountains straddling the border between France and Spain. Our route took us south over the Pyrenees into Spain and Navarre and to the Ernest Hemingway's town of Pamplona. From there, we followed a vector west across the north of Spain. At its far western end lies the ancient city of Santiago de Compostela. That was our Camino. For others, the Camino was the path that started wherever one happened to be when a decision was made to undertake the pilgrimage. As one advanced towards Santiago, these individual paths converged to form common routes, culminating for everyone with their arrival in Santiago. Spanish pilgrims followed routes that commenced in every corner of their country. The English often came by sea across the Bay of Biscay, landing on the north coast of the peninsula. The Italians traveled across southern France, passing through Toulouse. The 1,000 kilometers of our Camino, the Camino of Encarnita and me, presented us with a landscape that changed every day. Rising up in front of us when we started were the vivid green slopes of the Pyrenees, sometimes windy and wet, sometimes sunny and dry. A gradual descent took us through narrow valleys of the southern foothills, busy with mixed farming. Next came the rolling vineyards of Navarre and La Rioja, punctuated by hills and woods. For 2 weeks, we walked the flat Castilian Meseta, its extensive grain fields stretching to the far horizons. After León, we crossed mountains covered in heather and gorse and descended into the Bierzo. Climbing once again, we reached Galicia, dotted with small farms and cattle. Its choppy green hills owed their color to Atlantic breezes and ocean mist. Galicia, not surprisingly, is Celtic country, and its bagpipes are reminiscent of other better-known Celtic corners of Europe. The Camino offered, day after day, a constantly changing landscape, a landscape replete with gentle surprises, surprises to be savored as one walked. And Carnita once told me, to know a land, one must first walk it, from one end to the other. On foot the entire day, the pilgrim is granted a continuous opportunity to observe, and the myriad of details of the surrounding lands remain imprinted on the mind. Okay, what is a day on the Camino like? Certainly, many hours are spent walking, putting one foot in front of the other, following a trail that never seems to end. But what are the conditions under which one walks? And one doesn't walk for all 24 hours of the day. What is it that occurs during the remainder of the day? What are the bits and pieces that consume the hours when one is not walking? On my first Camino, I averaged 25 kilometers a day. The second time, with Encarnita as my companion, I averaged 17 kilometers a day. Our pace was slower because we wanted to enjoy the history, the culture, and especially the architectural riches I had walked by so quickly the first time. But let me talk about the daily routine, kilometer after kilometer, followed by a meal and by bed at night. I'll return later to what we encountered while walking. Whatever one sees, whatever the pace, the days share a common pattern. We would break the back of the day's walking before a late lunch. We would often come across a site that gave us access to wine or beer. And we were never averse to resting our legs at a friendly location that offered tapas. At the end of the day, we would enjoy a good dinner. Finding worthy places to eat was never a problem. Even a cluster as few as 4 or 5 houses in Spain will contain at least one cafe or bar. We targeted our sleeping place before the day began. Every town and city along the Camino has at least one hostel. Some are municipal, some are private. Some community hostels can sleep as many as 50 or 80 people, sometimes all in one room. Large or small, all have excellent facilities for personal cleansing and for washing clothes. Private hostels come in all sizes and shapes. Some offer rooms for two with a private shower. The hostels almost always will have cooking facilities so pilgrims can join forces and prepare their own meals. Many have gardens in which at the end of the day, one can relax. There are alternatives to the hostels. Very early on in our Camino, Encarnita made clear her preference for privacy at night. We had no trouble finding small hotels and bed and breakfasts. Many of these accommodations were true gems operated by individuals dedicated to the pilgrim traffic. In 2003, my pattern was a hostel for 3 nights out of 4 and sleeping the 4th night in a hotel. Some of the hotels are magnificent establishments, such as the 5-star Hostel de San Marcos in León, a palace that once housed the ruler of a large part of Spain, and the similarly starred Hostal de los Reyes Católicos in Santiago, which has provided accommodation to pilgrims continuously since the Middle Ages. Wherever one decides to stay, however, somewhere between the end of the walking day and sleep at night, one finds time to wash clothes, write a diary, and communicate with family back home. Hotels are more comfortable, but hostels are the best way to get to know your fellow walkers. The evening meal provides an opportunity to engage in deep conversation with those undertaking the same journey as yours. During days and nights on the Camino, you come to know better those whom you see on the trail, including their snoring habits. Apart from walking, eating, talking, and enjoying beautiful scenery, the pilgrim builds his understanding of the history of Spain, and indeed the history of all Europe, as he observes the towns, visits the churches, and surveys the monuments. The 7 cathedrals I encountered as I walked the Camino demonstrate the evolution of European architecture from Romanesque to Baroque. The intricate spires of the cathedral in Burgos are the crowning glory of Spanish Gothic architecture. The lofty vaults of the cathedral in León are ablaze with magical light streaming through the magnificent stained glass windows that look down on you from all sides. Awaiting the pilgrim at the end of his journey stands the Baroque facade of the Cathedral de Santiago de Compostela, its exquisite Romanesque Portico de la Gloria, incorporating in its stone carvings more than 200 biblical figures. Often it's not the grand monument that draws one's attention. The origins of the octagonal chapels found at Unate and Torres del Rio are uncertain, but are likely attributable to the Templar Knights. These chapels possess a mysterious appeal. In one, we found a Spanish photographer studying the light as he prepared for the wedding of a nephew who was marrying an American girl the nephew had met while walking the Camino. In the other, we settled back against the interior wall when we realized the small group of people inside were an a cappella choir testing the acoustics and preparing for a recital. I could admire for days the Romanesque church of San Martin in Fromisca. Simple in design, unadorned, the church incorporates lines, angles, curves that break what would otherwise be an austere stone form into a fancy of delights. It is easy to trace the history of the peninsula through its architecture. To the east of León, just outside the town of Mansilla de las Mulas, stands the Mozarabic church of San Miguel de Escalada. It was built in the 10th century, just after the Christians had recovered the territory from the Moors. At that time, the only artisans available for the project had been trained to erect buildings in the Moorish style. Accordingly, this delightful Christian church was built entirely upon Arabic horseshoe arches. Not all the architectural inventory comes from the distant past. That early 20th century Catalonian master, Antonio Gaudí, created two major works located on the Camino, the Casa Botín in León and the Bishop's Palace in Astorga. Once inside the quirky Gaudí exterior of the palace, the interplay of arches, vaults, and light create a cathedral in miniature. Every day spent on the Camino is guaranteed to produce fascinating reminders of what over the centuries mankind has been able to create. Why walk the Camino? It's a good question. What was it that caused the 100 or so people with whom I talked and the hundreds more whom I saw as I walked to undertake their voyage? I found fellow walkers to be on the Camino for many reasons, and most of the pilgrims were motivated not by one, but by a mixture of those reasons. I found few devout Christians driven solely and entirely by the strength of their faith, although I did encounter one walking barefoot. Perhaps the Christian tradition of the Camino held the strongest appeal for the many pilgrims I encountered from Korea. Each pilgrim proved to be an individual. This was not the first time Bruno Ettinger had walked on the Camino de Santiago. But what about Marie Luth from Holland? After carrying day in and day out for 20 years for a severely handicapped son, she and her husband had been forced to institutionalize the young man. To reorient her future life, she had walked all the way from the Puy-en-Velay in the French Massif Central to Santiago in Spain. She was not alone in coming to terms with herself. Rob from Holland had recently lost his wife of many years and was walking the Camino again and serving as a volunteer in a hospice. John, a fellow Ontarian and recent beneficiary of heart bypass surgery, was walking to reorient his view of life. But it's not just the pilgrims walking beside you that color your Camino experience. You talk with stationary figures embedded in the landscape. The quality conversations you have with other pilgrims is supplemented, expanded by conversations with individuals whose life is positionally fixed in the landscape through which you're passing. A conversation with an individual who lives next to the Camino path is a one-time event, but the exchanges can be deep and insightful. I will always remember Joseph, the farmer, who bolted out of his house announcing to anyone within shouting distance that an Air France flight with 200 or 300 passengers on board had crashed into the mid-Atlantic. He could not understand why anyone would allow his feet to leave solid soil and get on an airplane. Over the next 15 minutes, as his excitement cooled, he told us how he had done exactly what his grandfather had done. Our farmer had gone abroad to make a living, not in the early 20th century in the sugar fields of Cuba, where his grandfather had gone, but in the construction industry in Paris. Living very much on his own, working 10 to 12 hours a day, and spending the nights in a boarding house alone, he had returned to his village and the family farm where we met him. He had married, fathered 2 children, and remarried. Except for airplanes, Joseph was at peace with the world. Before we parted company, we were fully familiar with his farm inventory: 3 cows, half a dozen sheep, a harrow, and so on. I remember a Basque innkeeper, one day's walk south of the French border. It was a Sunday morning following an obviously boisterous time the night before. Liberté and égalité are fine, he said, but please knock off some of the fraternité. These conversations require time and an effort at the language. On this score, conversation was encouraged and enabled by my wife. It was not so much the language that got the conversation going as it was her obvious desire to listen. And Carnita could get words flowing from a stone monument. Those conversations partially caused our Camino together to take 2 weeks longer than the first time. I remember Milo, a shepherd we encountered high up in the mountains just before entering Galicia. He had worked most of his life as a taxi driver in Madrid before returning to the town from which he hailed, shifting his truck from point to point along the track while his dog managed the sheep in the valley below. He told us how a Canadian firm had reopened a local mine that had begun operations centuries ago in Carthaginian or Roman times. The Canadian venture closed after a dozen years, but not before its managers had married local girls and whisked them off to Canada. I want to talk for a few minutes about coincidence, which is another sort of pet notion of mine. The magnetism of coincidence is a force that draws me to the Camino. The 6 handshakes rule was introduced by a Hungarian author in 1929 in a short story, and it was turned into a play in the 1990s. The 6 handshakes rule rests on the premise that anyone can reach anyone else in the world by going through 5 intermediaries. Now, I don't know if the concept today known as 6 degrees of separation is valid or not, but if it is valid universally, the Camino shrinks the necessary degrees of separation from 6 to no more than 4. Walking the Camino, I am always finding unexpected coincidences thriving along the route. I'll illustrate by examples. Walking in Navarre in the very north of Spain, engaged in conversation, and Carnita and I missed a 90-degree turn in the route. An elderly local couple walking in the contrary direction waved vigorously at us. They wanted to get us going in the correct direction. When Carnita thanked them, she noticed their accents. The accent came from the province of Granada, my wife's city, far to the south. We chatted. It turned out that the sister of the lady, who was half of the couple, the sister of the lady had spent her whole life in a small village in rural Granada, working as a maid for the family of the rector of the University of Granada, who was the best friend and personal physician of my wife's father, my father-in-law. Coincidence. But example number 2. I was sitting in the cathedral in Burgos, admiring its beautifully carved medieval wooden choir stalls. I was hoping someone would turn on the lights so I could better see the choir. Suddenly, I felt a hand on my elbow, a voice timidly asking, "Is that you, Tio Juan, Uncle John?" It was Luisito, my wife's nephew, who lives in the city of Granada, 600 kilometers to the south. He was on his way north to a vacation in Normandy, in France. We were traveling on vectors that were set at right angles to each other. Our paths shared that tiny intersection of space for less than 15 minutes. A third example. 2 German pilgrims sat down at our table in a rural restaurant in a tiny village in Galicia. Conversation ensued. One of the 2 pilgrims at our table referenced his next-door neighbor in Germany. That neighbor had lived for a long time in Canada. The neighbor was a university professor, but he's now retired. Believe it or not, I think some of you might know him, as that retired professor taught at the University of Toronto. Not only was the neighbor a U of T professor, he was one of the professors who guided my wife through her PhD program, Otmar Hedgie. He would have been attached to the Spanish department. I could list other examples in support of my thesis on coincidences. I'm convinced there is what the Spaniards would refer to as a cofraderia that brings pilgrims together. On the Camino, there are only 4 degrees of separation. Before finishing, I will return just for a couple of moments to why one should walk the Camino. The strongest force behind my Camino was the treasure chest of history and stories that I encountered. Some are verifiable, others are legend. The movement of peoples across the peninsula over the centuries has been continuous, and each wave has left its legacy. Celts, Phoenicians, Romans, Jews, Visigoths, Muslims, Christians. The history is endless, and the romances and tragedies of knights and kings abound. Who is to say if the story of the 7 infants of Lara is fact or fiction? One medieval family, reported to be in fierce competition with another medieval family, kidnapped and slew the 7 infants of its opponent. Should the story be deemed fact or fiction? The opening centuries later of 7 small cathafs at the Sufso monastery revealed the skeletons of 7 small children, all without skulls. You can decide. The pilgrim encounters the fundamental building blocks of European architecture and art in the Camino's Romanesque, Gothic, Renaissance, and Baroque structures. Leon, a city so important to the Reconquest, is home to the Basilica of San Isidro, which houses some of the best preserved Romanesque frescoes in Europe. Leon's cathedral is a Gothic masterpiece. Its interior ablaze with light filtered through brilliant stained glass windows. And the Baroque palace of former Leon chief constable now awaits you as a 5-star hotel. And the Casa Botín and Leon bears testimony to the talents of that 20th century master, Antonio Gaudí. Some pilgrims are drawn to the Camino by the physical challenge. Walking day in and day out does impose a demanding discipline. 2 Dutchmen in their 40s, lean, tanned, and gaunt, were covering the ground at the rate of 40 kilometers a day. Unfortunately, I can't give you their names as I was not able to keep pace with them long enough to find out. There are those who seek conversation and companionship. Pilgrims talk. They talk about themselves. They talk while walking, and they talk during the evenings. They share stories, hopes, and fears with fellow walkers and with individuals whose home is right there alongside the Camino. Inhibitions and reservations vanish. Camineros open up to each other. Every week on the Camino, you make fast friends. Some of those friendships evaporate the next day, but others you retain for the rest of your lives. And Carnita and I have come to know Roger, an English astrophysicist, and our families have spent time together. Frank and I worked together for 35 years. 2 months walking together built a much, much stronger relationship. And there are genuine characters. I encountered Angelo pushing a bicycle up a steep grade. Angelo was a 2nd-generation Greek, born 65 years earlier in Quebec City, but resident for decades in California. He had begun his Camino much farther back than us in Paris. After several weeks, he concluded he would never get to Santiago that way. Passing a young woman in a small French town, he bought on the spot her bicycle. He dumped his backpack into the bicycle's handbasket. From then on, he was pushing up hills and coasting down. We shared lunch with Angelo in Santiago just after he had shipped the bicycle back to its owner in France. You know, after a conference, one is often asked, what did you take away from it? So you might well ask me, what did I bring away from my time on the Camino? First, I arrived in Santiago happy and excited. Weeks spent walking on open trails under clear skies, breathing the freshest of air. Those weeks leave me feeling physically wonderful. Uncomplicated days, free from the normal routine, crossing a landscape dotted with cultural treasures, that works wonders on my mental makeup. Secondly, I enjoyed the opportunity of opening and exploring honest relationships. The barrier that so often impede and inhibit interaction between individuals simply do not exist on the Camino. The origins and makeup of the people you meet are so different from those you find on a non-Camino day. Some possess stories we remember, others become friends we value. Walking the Camino brings to life for me many important chapters of European history. Is there any better way of coming to grips with the tradition of Europe than by encountering it day after day in simple settings? The stories that make up European history become your stories when you find your feet on the ground where they played out. And finally, the pilgrim gains an improved perspective on one's place on this globe as he passes a steady stream of reminders of human endeavors from centuries past. Pilgrim realizes he is only a small dot, a dot slowly moving across a vast landscape, following the ribbon of the trail that stretches forward to a distant horizon under a never-ending sky. That ends what I wanted to say, and I'd be quite happy to solicit questions, and I will attempt answers.
Thank you so much, John, for that really interesting talk. Let's take a 10-minute break and then come back for questions. So we're back at 5 minutes after 3. Meanwhile, there's coffee, cookies, brownies.